Welcome to CLESTalk, Law for Sustainable Cities, a podcast series dedicated to exploring how cities intersect with law and environmental sustainability. This podcast engages in different urban and environmental legal themes and features special guests, including our class researchers. South African Research Chair in Cities, Law and Environmental Sustainability, forms part of the South African Research Initiative of the National Research Foundation of South Africa, and it operates under the Faculty of Law at the Northwest University in South Africa. I am Thando Mphahlele, a Doctor of Law researcher at CLES, and for today's episode, I am your host. Our topic for today is the adequacy of legislative frameworks for financing climate vulnerability hazards in South African cities. In simple terms, we are asking whether South African laws and legislative policies, as well as financial systems, are adequate enough to help cities deal with climate risks such as floods, droughts, heat waves, and storm damage. These are not distant or abstract problems. They affect people's homes, roads, water supply, sanitation, electricity, livelihoods, and safety. So across the South African country, climate-related disasters are placing growing pressure on municipalities, especially in vulnerable communities and informal settlements. While South Africa has various laws and policies which seek to strengthen the country's climate response as well as to support climate resilience, the key remains whether can the law be translated into real findings. So today, our guest is Dr. Fredua Agyemang. Dr. Fredua Agyemang is a postdoctoral research fellow at the South African Research Chair in Cities, Law and Environmental Sustainability, the Faculty of Law at the Northwest University. He holds a PhD in Urban and Regional Planning from Northwest University, a Master's in Town and Regional Planning from the University of KwaZulu-Natal, 2 Master of Laws degrees in Public Law, 1 in Extractive Industry Law in Africa from the University of Pretoria, and the other in Environmental Law from the University of Western Cape. In addition, he obtained a postgraduate certificate in education from the University of South Africa and a Bachelor of Sciences in Land Economy from Kwame Nkrumah University of Science and Technology. He has received multiple awards in recognition of his academic excellence, including the NRF Postdoctoral Research Fellowship Award and the Growth Bursary Award at the University of Western Cape, as well as the postgraduate merit and doctoral bursaries from Northwest University. His research focuses on resilient cities, particularly urban informalities, energy transition, climate change, disaster risk management, and mining, while also exploring the interaction between law and policy in areas such as climate governance, disaster risk reduction, energy governance, and rural natural resource management. Dr. Agyemang, thank you and welcome to this episode.
Thank you very much, Ms. Mphahlele, for having me. This is a timely and important conversation because climate change is no longer a future concern, as you already alluded to. It is already affecting cities across South Africa. So thanks for having me.
Thank you. On that note, can you briefly just give a little bit of context on how climate change is affecting the state of South African cities?
Ms. Mphahlele, let's assume You wake up after days of relentless rain. Roads have been washed away. Bridges have been collapsed. Homes have disappeared beneath flood waters. Businesses are closed. Schools cannot open, and thousands of families have been displaced. The mayor wants to rebuild a stronger infrastructure before the next disaster strikes, but there is an invisible obstacle. The money isn't there. And even when the money or the funding exists, outdated legal financial rules often prevent municipalities from assessing or spending it effectively. This is not a hypothetical situation. As I'm still speaking, we have already witnessed the devastating 2022 floods in adequacy, which destroyed roads, bridges, hospitals, and water infrastructure, causing damage estimated in tens of billions of rand. Cape Town's Day Zero drought brought the city dangerously close to running out of water. Johannesburg and Tshwane are also not excluded as they continue to experience destructive flash floods that overwhelm aging stormwater systems, while Nelson Mandela Bay has endured years of severe drought and water restrictions. These are no longer isolated disasters. They are becoming the new norm as we speak now. Much attention has been given to reducing greenhouse gas emissions, but today we are asking a different question. Who pays for climate adaptation, disaster preparedness, and recovery? More importantly, do South Africa's law provide municipalities with the financial tools they need to protect people before disaster strike? So these are big concerns that needs to be addressed. Ms. Mpahleri.
Thank you for that insight. As we begin, can you please briefly just tell us about what is climate vulnerability hazards for anyone that is asking in relation to South African cities? What do we mean, and why do you think South African cities are becoming increasingly vulnerable to them?
Thanks for the question. Climate vulnerability hazards are climate-related events that such as floods, drought, heat waves, severe storms, wildfires, and coastal erosion that threatens people's lives, infrastructure, ecosystem, and local economies. Vulnerability in itself refers to how exposed communities are to these hazards and how well they can prepare for, cope with, and recover from them. As we all know, South African cities are becoming more vulnerable because climate change is increasing the frequency and intensity of extreme weather events, rapid urbanization, aging infrastructure, and expansion of informal settlements into floodplains and other high-risk areas further increase this risk. Social and economic inequalities also make it more difficult for vulnerable communities to recover after disasters. So that is my 2 cents as far as climate vulnerability is concerned in South African cities.
Thank you so much for that detailed explanation. Can you please share just a few real-life examples of those which do affect or mostly local communities in South Africa?
Yeah, as when I was providing the context of climate vulnerability and climate financing, I already said the 2002 eThekwini floods claimed more than 400 lives and destroyed roads, bridges, homes, and essential services. Cape Town, for instance, experienced the zero drought, which brought the city close to running out of water, while Nelson Mandela Bay continues to experience severe water shortages. Johannesburg and Tshwane are not also excluded. So these are some of the realities or practical examples in the context of climate vulnerability pertaining to South African cities.
All right, thank you. So when we talk about financing climate vulnerability hazards, what exactly are we financing?
Yeah, that is a very good question because a lot of people normally don't really know what exactly are we financing. But in the context of climate financing, we refer to it as funding projects that reduce climate risk before disasters occur and help communities recover afterwards. Climate finance also supports climate adaptation, disaster risk reduction, resilient infrastructure, and emergency preparedness. Investing in prevention is generally far less costly than rebuilding after disasters, as you know.
Thank you. So does this mean that this includes building stronger infrastructure or disaster preparedness or things like early warning systems or systems that protect vulnerable communities or all of this?
Absolutely. It includes upgrading stormwater drainage, strengthening roads and bridges, improving water security, restoring wetlands, developing climate resilient housing, investing in early warning systems, strengthening emergency response, and protecting vulnerable communities through better planning and resilient infrastructure. We may go on and on and on, but I believe these are some of the key issues as far as climate-related financing is concerned.
Yeah, that would be enough. I get the whole picture. So why is financing such a central issue in responding to climate risks? And what happens when cities do not have enough funding to prepare for or recover from climate disasters?
I would say financing is essential because municipalities cannot implement climate adaptation measures without adequate resources. You know, they need funding to maintain infrastructure, reduce disaster risk, and strengthen emergency preparedness. For instance, without sufficient funding, cities often delay maintenance and adaptation projects, leaving communities more vulnerable. This results in greater damage, higher recovery costs, and repeated disaster losses.
All right, can you give an example of how underfunding might affect local communities before, during, or even after disasters?
Let's take, for instance, if a municipality cannot afford to upgrade stormwater drainage before heavy rainfall, flooding may repeatedly damage homes, roads, and businesses. Repairing this damage often costs far more than investing in preventive infrastructure in the first place. So this is one of the few examples that can give you a clue about if municipalities fail to secure funding to, let's say, provide, for instance, stormwater facilities which seek to control, let's say, flooding or seek to direct rainwater. Those rainwater might find itself in people's home and it might cause damage to people's properties and a whole lot of things might happen.
All right, thank you. In relation to that, what are the main laws or policies or regulatory frameworks in South Africa that provide financial assistance to cities in terms of climate-related risks and disasters? And also, in your view, are they adequate for financing climate vulnerability hazards in cities?
Yeah, we have like several laws and policies pertaining to climate-related risk. Several laws, including the Constitution, which provide the foundation. Section 24, as we know, guarantees the right to an environment that is not harmful to health or well-being, while sections 152, 153, and 156 require municipalities to promote sustainable development and deliver essential services. The Climate Change Act 22 of 2024 also aimed to strengthen climate resilience. It requires climate risk and vulnerability assessment and obliges municipalities to prepare climate response implementation plans, and integrate them into their planning process. However, it does not establish a dedicated climate adaptation fund. We can also speak to the Disaster Management Act 57 of 2002, which promotes disaster risk reduction through municipal disaster management planning and early warning systems. However, Section 56 primarily provides financial assistance after disasters, making the system largely reactive. Also, we can also speak to another important legislation, which is Municipal Finance Management Act 56 of 2003, which regulates municipal budgeting and financial management. Provisions in the legislation, such as Section 17 to 19, govern municipal budgets and capital projects, but limited municipal revenues often restrict long-term climate investments. Other important legislation also include Division of Revenue Act, enacted annually under Section 214 of the Constitution, allocate funding to municipalities through grants, including infrastructure and disaster-related grants, although these are not dedicated climate adaptation funds. I could also speak of the National Environmental Management Act 107 of 1998, that is the NEMA, which promotes sustainable development through Section 2, while Section 24 requires environmental consideration in development decisions. Together with SPLOMA, that is the Spatial Planning Land Use Management Act, these laws support climate resilient planning. So they are quite bucket list of laws that speak to climate financing and resilient cities and all that.
All right, thank you for that. Do you still have any other legislation, or those are the ones that, are the main ones?
These are the key legislations that we have. We could also add something on the Municipal Structures Act and all that, the Municipal Systems Act. But as far as I'm concerned, these are the main legislation that we could think of. Because when it comes to municipalities mandated to design an IDP, they could identify areas or communities which are vulnerable so that they could really target IDP in response to those vulnerable communities in terms of climate-related disasters or vulnerabilities.
All right, thank you for that. What are in your view, that you would say those are the biggest obstacles that municipalities face when they are trying to access or manage funding as it relates to adapting to the climate or disaster risk reduction?
There are quite a wide range of obstacles, but the main ones or the main challenges are fragmented legislation, limited municipal budgets, complex funding requirements, insufficient institutional capacity. As you know, many municipalities have significant climate responsibilities, but lack the technical expertise and financial resources needed to implement adaptation projects. So these are the suite of challenges that I can make mention of. As from this, we've already made mention of quite substantive number of legislation. So issues of fragmentation comes to play as far as legislation regulating climate related disaster vulnerabilities are concerned.
All right, thank you. How can you categorize them? Are these challenges mainly legal, financial, administrative, or political?
I think they are all interconnected, but the biggest challenge or the challenges are legal and financial. As you know, municipalities are legally required to address climate risk, yet funding mechanisms are limited and often difficult to access. Administrative capacity also varies considerably across municipalities. So these are the key challenges that I can think of or make mention of.
All right, thank you. So, do you think our laws or the funding systems focus more on responding after disasters happen, or do they support long-term prevention and resilience building?
That is quite a heavy question, but I would say recent legislation encourages prevention and climate adaptation. However, South Africa's funding system remains largely reactive, as I can say, because municipalities generally find it easier to access funding after disasters than to secure resources for preventative projects before disasters occur. So I would say our funding mechanism is mostly reactive because it's much easier to present a case of disaster or in order to secure funding than to go and present the case in a hypothetical sense, because people want to see the devastation and all that before they could come to the aid of the vulnerable communities. So the law or the funding mechanism is mostly reactive, as they want to see the damage or the aftermath of the disaster before people could come to the aid of the vulnerable communities.
All right, so if I get you correctly, it is easier for a city to get money after a flood than to get money beforehand to improve drainage, housing, or early warning systems.
Yeah, that's exactly what I was trying to say, because municipalities often struggle to secure funding to improve drainage systems or strengthen flood protection before disasters. Yet, once flooding occurs, emergency funding becomes available. You see, investing earlier would save lives, reduce losses, and lower long-term recovery. But often at times, you wait for disaster to occur. So I will advise that if we could strengthen or if you could invest more into resilient infrastructures before or prior to disasters, that would be a way to avert the enormity of the disaster.
On that very note, what would be your recommendations in consideration of all of these findings with regards to South Africa's legislative or financing regulatory framework to better protect cities from climate vulnerability hazards, and why?
Yeah, I believe South Africa should establish a dedicated municipal climate adaptation fund and also strengthen coordination between the Climate Change Act, Disaster Management Act, Municipal Finance Management, and Division of Revenue Act, and also increase climate-specific grants for municipalities. You see, the country should also modernize municipal financing rules to support long-term climate investments and enable greater access to innovative financing mechanisms such as green bonds and blended finance. Yeah, I think that could be my recommendation, because we've already stated that the laws are fragmented. So if you could have like coherence in the legislation, I believe it would go a long way to help. And if you could also have a diverse system or diverse mechanism to finance climate-related vulnerabilities, as I've already made mention of green bond, of which Cape Town had it to support their water infrastructures. We could also tap into those funding available internationally, which could go a long way to help us to deal with climate-related vulnerabilities.
All right, I think it's safe to say that it's those vulnerable communities most of the times that are then impacted by this. How do you think they are affected? Like, what is the impact of the financing system as it is? And what are the practical changes that would make a difference for those ordinary local members?
Ms. Mpashlele, I think the greatest improvements would be shifting from disaster response to disaster prevention, and also investing in resilient infrastructure, also improving drainage, reliable water systems, and effective early warning technologies before disasters occur. I believe once we take these measures, it will better protect lives, homes, businesses, and livelihoods of the vulnerable communities, whilst also reducing the long-term cost of recovery. So I think that is what we can do. We don't have to wait for disaster to befall on us before we start thinking about how to be very adapt, or how to adapt our cities to disasters through investment.
All right, thank you so much for that. And thank you so much for being so insightful for this insightful conversation and insights.
Yeah, thank you for having me. If there is one message I would like listeners to remember, it's this. Climate change is already reshaping our cities, from the floods in eThekwini to the drought in Cape Town and Nelson Mandela Bay. Municipalities are, as we know, are on the front line of climate crisis. We have made significant legislative progress through Climate Change Act, but legislation alone cannot build resilient cities. We also need sustainable financing mechanisms that follow or that allow municipalities to invest in prevention rather than simply responding after disasters occur. Building climate resilience is ultimately an investment in people's lives, livelihoods, and future of our city.
Thank you so much for that. This brings us to the end of this episode. And as we come to the end of today's conversation, one thing is clear that climate change is not only an environmental issue, it is also a legal issue, a financial issue, a governance issue, and most importantly, a justice issue. For South African cities, the challenge is not simply to respond when disaster strikes. The challenge is to build systems that prevent harm, reduce vulnerability, and ensures that the people that are most exposed to climate risks are not left behind. So we need proper funding, clear responsibilities, as well as capable institutions. So thank you for joining us on our CLESTalk, Law for Sustainable Cities. Please look out for our social media for any conferences or communication or more interesting conversations. So until next time, thank you and bye-bye.